present, we all see mortification of some form or the other, where the organization is trying to redeem itself, to improve its image in front of not just its own people, but the public at large. So what we observe is, and trying to reclaim social legitimacy, which he talks about, that is what the organizations want to do, how we perceive them socially, how people look at these organizations after the crisis has done and the damage is done. And then we all talk about the government intervention. That's another thing that we observe through crisis. Now, not all crises that we see the government intervening, but these crises being on a global scale, a global platform, you have the government intervening in all of these crises. Now, we see BP was perceived as a villain here, but in the UK it was perceived as a scapegoat, where it did not take responsibility for the total impact that it had on its public. Now, the other thing we talk about, Satyam case highlights the corporate lacunae in corporate governance in India. It did gain 15 new customers after the crisis, so you think that the crisis response was still effective even though it lost a few of its customers. Now, the other thing I point out here is the Indian government reacted to this crisis in a more positive way. They jumped on it, they understood it, and they reacted, unlike what we see in the case of Iran, where the government really took its time to step into it, even understanding that the impact was so high that we really had to, because that was a huge crisis. It was billions of dollars, and they really did not really do much in order to account for this crisis. So this is what we see, which is a contrast to Iran, where the government of India really did a great job. Now, finding 3, where we talk about shifting of the blame, as we see in all these crises, is really common. It is done by all of this, and this results from, and it shows this lack of accountability and blaming. These are prudent in these cases. Corrective action, as we discussed, all these organizations seek to corrective action and making sure they're back on track and back to doing business. Then again, the new thing that we're really looking at crisis today is the use of technology. Today, organizations and crisis communication managers and PR practitioners really worry about the use of technology, because if you are in crisis, if you're stuck on a plane and if things are bad, people have these phones, you click pictures and you send it across and the world knows about it.
Right.
Today, if you look at, in fact, the political crisis in Egypt, they say they're blaming Google and they're pointing fingers at technology for what has happened. So the role of technology today in crisis is much more evident than what we've seen maybe a decade ago. Now, in BP's case, we had bloggers who wrote about it. They really blew BP for their response strategies. They were slow, so they took rescue to that. They called for a boycott on Facebook. Facebook is such a powerful tool in itself today. And they had use of websites to localize the crisis. They had websites. BP had a crisis for people, those
they chose 4 states, that were affected by the crisis. And Florida, Alabama, along the region. And they had websites for those 4 states. And where people who were filing claims, they had local, people to go to, and didn't have to deal with a lot of red tape on the national level.
So that was, and then Twitter feeds, of course, those 120 words, they say a lot. So that was another thing that they used. And in the case of Satyam, we had bloggers too writing, and to my knowledge, I think even BenQ too. So we really see the use of technology today unfolding in crisis. The last slide, I think that is, we talk about public relation practitioners basically experience new opportunities, especially communicating in this flat world, international publics that we talk about. These are newer challenges that they're coming across. Image repair strategy, what we see, has been employed in all these 3 cases. It was visibly seen, and the kind of rhetoric that these leaders use in order to salvage their image or their face. Now, there's another thing I really want to focus on, no one-size-fits-all approach. though the prices were similar, but we cannot go with the general belief that this is the way it is, these are the strategies that we are going to do, because each crisis have to be adopted and handled in a much more localized way. So that is why we have that no one-size-fits-all statement.
Let me add something too while she's switching the slides, especially to that point of, that there's no one size that fits all. What we find in a lot of these cases, and if you research back even to the 80s and 90s, looking at some of the cases using Benoit's framework, it really involves a selection of the right strategies, right? The mixture of the right strategies for your particular case. And what we analyze, in some of the cases, it's the right mix of strategies, and then in other cases, it's not. And there are several what we have found, especially when Benita talked about the use of shifting the blame, that generally the public has concluded that that is not an effective strategy. It's not received well, you see, because there's the impression then that you're not culpable, you're not taking responsibility for something that you are obviously involved in. So the right mix of strategies.
Now, these cases present us, highlight issues of accountability. Who's to be blamed? Who's responsible? And who's going to be taking this forward? So it's accountability and transparency. Were they transparent enough to communicate with the key stakeholders, the public at large? So there are issues about that. And this has an impact on the image repair and legitimacy. How legitimate was this organization? Did they do an effective job communicating and moving on from there? To regain this legitimacy back, to trust us again, because a crisis situation leads you to a situation where it's hard to get back that trust that people once believed in. So it highlights these issues. Now, what we are talking about, future research, where we talk about the influence of culture, that's a strong case. Now, these are international crises. Now, in the case of BP, it's based out of UK, and the crisis happened here. The way the culture works here is different when you're comparing it to UK.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure the measures that you adopt are more local. You have local influences. In case of Satyam, the way they had to operate on a different level altogether. They had to communicate with key stakeholders and customers worldwide, but as well as resolve the issue on a much local, on the local front. So it's again the cultural influences, because again you have to make sure culturally you are doing it correctly. So, and then future that we are planning focus on is ethics. Was it ethically right? And then social legitimacy and organizational learning. These are the future focus that we plan to focus cases on. And
yeah, what we found with this paper, we were writing this paper for a conference, and the study was so extensive. The amount of work that we put in. This was a real thick description case analysis, and we used a combination of several different materials, not just news coverage for these cases. We also used statements, we used broadcast transcripts, we used statements by the corporate leaders themselves, we used their websites, speeches, press releases, all kinds of different materials. And we really have two levels of analysis. One where we use Benoit's framework, and then another level of analysis that is more thematic, where we have really contributed to discussions of accountability, that issue of transparency in your communication, and then ultimately whether or not you will regain social legitimacy among your public. We can open it up for questions.
Please. Or comments?
You guys were taking notes.
Please. Questions?
An observer.
What I'm interested in is how, this is fascinating because you're looking at the cultural differences and you're doing it international and global. What sparked this sort of discussion? Because you said most of, or this sort of research, this direction, because you said that most of the research was on American companies.
Absolutely. Because, for my dissertation work, I did my PhD at Howard University in D.C., and for my